Hey everyone, welcome to Epic. This is the Keeper Track. I'm Bob Bledsoe of Green Room Pythons, and today I've got Riley Jimison of Riley's Reptiles here to talk to us about carpet pythons. I have a couple carpet pythons, and Riley has way more than I do, so he's the guy to talk about it. Hey Riley, welcome.
How we doing? Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, Riley, tell me this, because I know that you have some other species, and you've kept snakes for years. And I think you've kind of landed on carpet pythons as your main species to work with. Am I right about that?
Absolutely.
Why is that?
You know, I can honestly find something to like in any reptile, ectotherm, amphibian, but few really agree with kind of the personality that I find so endearing and exciting, and just all the versatility and colors. I'll never forget the first day I stared down a big adult female jungle carpet in the face with her big muscular head and the beautiful black and yellow stripes on her labial pits. And I was instantly hooked. And ever since I got my hands on them and started working with them and figuring out their level of intelligence and responsiveness and their sizes and the color palette, they've just always kind of stayed around. And I've just accepted that they're the perfect snake for me. No slouch to any other species. If I could keep a little bit of everything, I would. But if I could only keep one group of animals, it would be the carpet python group. They by far have the most diversity, tons of personality, and they're so much fun to interact with.
Yeah. So speaking of that group, let's jump into that. For people that are completely unfamiliar with carpet pythons, tell us about the different species within when we talk about carpets.
Yeah, so carpet pythons as a term refers to a collective group of animals. So you have your diamond carpet pythons, you have your coastals, your jungles, you have Darwins, you have Southwesterns, you have the Cape Yorks, you have Papuans, you have inland. So there are several different species and subspecies. And some taxonomy has recently changed based on some updated DNA analysis, and so we kind of have things on track with appropriate divisions of some of the proper arrangement of like the northern and southern coastals, and just some reclassification of a few animals. And it's just the history behind them, the fact that we can't get them exported from Australia. There's a lot going on with them. And, I think a lot of folks, when they look at Morelia and the carpet python group, that might be confusing. If you're coming from one species and you're looking to dabble into another one, and you're stepping in and realizing you have to understand different species, subspecies, and morphs and localities associated with those various species and subspecies, it can be very overwhelming for sure. Whereas something like a ball python, it's just knowing the different morphs. They're all one species, and so everything's kind of copacetic in that regard.
Right.
But yeah.
So with those subspecies, and we're going to get into behavior and such like that a little bit down the road, but just basically within these subspecies, is there a massive difference in behavior, size? I know that looks are kind of a thing. There is a difference in looks, but is that blown out of proportion, or is it really a thing?
I would say it's definitely more exaggerated than it really is. You can say on average, 95% of carpet pythons are going to fall in the 5 to 7 foot range. They are quite flexible with how you feed them. And what I mean by that is that can really influence their adult size. There are sort of genetic capacities and maximums and minimums for all animals. I would think, even though snakes are sort of indeterminate growers, sort of have a maximum range for each species, and you can really push that with how much and how often you feed them. So I think a lot of it gets over exaggerated. It's very easy to see a carpet python sprawled out on somebody's table at a show or on the lawn and think, wow, that's a 10-foot snake. And maybe in reality, it's more like 7 feet. Now, that isn't to say that those 3-meter animal plus haven't been found in the wild. but I think there's definitely a difference between some wild animals and the captive population here in the States. So with that being said, yeah, that 5 to 7 foot range, they're very amenable, easy to keep. And I think they have a reputation that still is rather undeserved. You know, I still to this day hear folks thinking that they get 10, 12 feet and are monstrous and quite aggressive even. And I've just never experienced that.
Yeah, yeah. You know, it seems to be kind of a weird reputation that they have. That, or it's not reputation, but it's this idea that for most snakes, we say that we tend to overfeed all snakes and even carpet pythons. But with other species, we say we overfeed these snakes. We don't see them that big in the wild. You know, we don't see snakes the size of our big ball pythons that we have in the wild like that. They're a little bit thinner, a little bit smaller. But with carpet pythons, I think they're eating wallabies and stuff because you see massive, like I'm thinking specifically of like coastal carpet pythons. I see some in the wild and they're freaking huge.
Yeah.
But I feel like they don't need to get that big.
No, and I would imagine those are probably a select few individuals. I do have some friends that live out in Australia who have sent me photos of some wild southern coastals that they have caught. And one in particular was caught by a friend of mine. And in the photo, it had a massive bulge, like it had eaten some sort of tree possum or something like that. And that animal was over 3 meters. Now, that was the only one that good friend of mine has ever caught of that size. But we regularly see videos or social media posts, especially in the Darwin area, of multiple snake sheds being found in people's attics, crawl spaces, things like that. And they're massive. They're absolutely massive sheds. Despite they stretch, but still they come from very large snakes. And every now and again we see videos of two animals falling off somebody's roof, two males combating or something like that.
Through the ceiling, right?
Yeah, or through the ceiling. And they are always very large animals. And so I would imagine those very select, successful few in certain populations can certainly attain that size. But I would think that's probably more of the exception than the rule for even some of those animals.
Yeah, yeah. So with regard to these different subspecies, I always want to say locality, but they are subspecies. As far as temperament and behavior, do you see any difference? First of all, let's establish real quick. Do you work with all the subspecies?
Yes. Yeah. Everything that we can actually get in the United States. The only ones we can't get are imbricata, the southwesterns. Just never did.
So you have experience with all the subspecies, at least that we can work with in the United States. Do you find any behavior differences as babies, as adults, just generally? Do they act different?
Very subtle differences, but nothing really that is going to change the way I keep or approach them. I will say, Darwins tend to want to perch more than some of the others. They just kind of have that natural tendency to want to get up off the ground a little bit more from babies to adults. You'll see that a little more often. The Papuans, or what we used to call IJs, they tend to like to soak more or prefer a more humid environment, and some jungles will even participate in similar behaviors. Bredli's pythons and diamond pythons tend to like it a little on the cooler side. They'll tolerate extremes on the high and cold end. They're very hardy animals, but I often find they're always off on the cooler end of the enclosure unless they're digesting a meal. You
mentioned Bredli's. I was going to say, let's include Bredli's in this talk also. So let's go to that just real fast tangent. How close are Bredli's to because Morelia bredli are not carpet pythons technically, but they're very close. How close would you say they are, or should they be part of the carpet python?
Well, if we're going to look at the family as a whole, you can lump them under that carpet python nomenclature, but they're not a Morelia spilota. So a lot of the subspecies are spilota subspecies. And so bredli are their own. If you think of Australia as the island it is, and then sort of the red center as an island within an island, it is so isolated from other ranges that animals that find success living in that area sort of speciate on their own, and Bredli's pythons are no different. So yes, they have a similar, almost identical like body structure, head structure. but they are genetically very diverse from the rest of them. In fact, the closest relative would be a diamond python at its core, but even then, they're still different. But I call them carpet pythons. I lump them in conceptually with carpet pythons. I would never say somebody is wrong if they consider them not a carpet python. It's all kind of just common name semantics as far as that goes. If you understand the species and subspecies differentiation and that they're just different on some level, that works. Sure.
And so behavior with the bredli versus the other carpet pythons, do you see much of a difference?
They have a tendency to be a lot more docile in reputation. That I also attribute a little bit more to just individual personality, because I have worked with some that are not always as trustworthy as their reputation precedes. That being said, I've also worked with, very cantankerous coastal carpet pythons or jungle carpet pythons or Papuan carpets for that matter, when, 9 times out of 10 that isn't the case. So there's enough personality to each of them. And I would say that as a whole, they all sort of behave more or less the same.
Sure. Okay. And for the record, by the way, I have a yearling coastal and I have a yearling bredli. So mine are still very young. I've had them for, 6 months or something like that. Neither one has taken a shot at me. They're great, lovely little snakes.
Awesome.
But I don't have nearly enough of a sample size to say this type of snake is like this. I just have a couple little snakes. With regard to that reputation, the carpet pythons in general have a reputation of being bitey. And I don't know if it's because they've got these big sort of chunky heads that people are intimidated by. And they're like, oh, I don't want to get bit by that. So they say they're bitey. But what's the reality versus the myth in this?
I would say it's very situational. They're very quick to turn defensive if they're concerned in an unfamiliar scenario, especially if it's after dark. I find after dark, after 7:30, even the friendliest carpet python has a tendency to really want to mentally be in a hunting mode. And so they might react as if thinking there's food available. But sometimes if you catch them when they're sleeping, or it just happens to be a little bit of a twitchy individual, it can be very situational. And then it's more just about not triggering something in their face. I have all sorts of interactions where I'm filming and a snake is near my face because I'm trying to keep it in frame. And it's the heat of my breath and what's going on visually that sort of they're not used to. And so in proximity, they get a little bit defensive. And so sometimes you'll see that, but it never happens when you're just handling them and just kind of taking them out and doing stuff. They will react if they feel confused or defensive. But it's usually the younger animals. The older animals have a wealth of experience under their belt at that point, especially if they've been handled well. And I'm also finding, some anecdotal evidence to show that there is influence on how they're raised that can influence their temperament, at least to a degree. That was going to
be my next question, actually, is early experiences and setup.
Sure.
What do you think that is that influences the temperament to make them more?
So like any small new creature that is entering Earth for the first time in the wild, they are programmed to hide, to go straight into shelter, safety, think that everything's out to kill them. They're tiny, they're fragile, they're delicate. And in Australia, a lot of things want to eat a little baby snake. So what you have to do, in my opinion, is think of things from their perspective. They're a little baby snake. They want shelter, they want security, and they don't want a whole lot of visual stimulus and things overwhelming them without some sort of experience and kind of going at that pace where they can explore it. And the first step I found is actually letting the babies, when you have a clutch, stay as a clutch together and shed out as a group. Those first 2 weeks of that thigmotactic sort of tactile contact with conspecifics, I don't know if that's what's going on in their head, but to me, it seems to turn off and desensitize some like high level stimuli that might otherwise stress them out and terrify them. And it gives them a couple weeks of like realizing, look, things moving around you, it's probably your siblings. It's not going to hurt you. Like, it's okay. First 2 weeks, safety in numbers sort of thing. And I find when I started doing that, as opposed to separating babies right from the hatch point, that it created instantly a noticeable difference across, 10 clutches of much more confident animals that weren't behaving defensive. And I raised them up the exact same way I'd raised animals years prior, just didn't separate them right away. So there's something to being around their clutch mates that seems to help create some confidence. And then after that, it's just a lot of my consistency. I pick them up regularly. If they're going to strike, I'm not going to put them back and teach them like defensive striking behavior gets them the result, which is being left alone. I get bit by babies all the time if they're going to figure that out. And I don't mind. It's very inconsequential when they're that little. I like to keep them in a small enclosure with, just kind of the basics, hide, water bowl, perch, things like that. And keep them secure and dark for the first few months. And then they get confident very fast. And the more you just kind of take a minute, handle them, clean them, spend a moment with them, at least a couple times a week, they really learn that you're not there to hurt them. Those first few weeks with their clutch mates make a big difference. And I've just seen a world of difference in their temperament. I've hatched babies that, never calm down, and at 2-3 years old are still very, very terrified of me and defensive. So it's interesting to see how much of a role that first couple weeks plays with them.
Yeah. Yeah. And then what about setup? Like what would be a wrong way, a common wrong way that someone might set up a new, they buy one, they're not a breeder. They've got one carpet python. They just got it. They're setting it up. And what would be the wrong way to do it?
So, I mean, it's hard to say it's a wrong way because I have had one customer do this and it worked out just fine for them. But generally, I would advocate not taking a little baby and putting it straight into something like an adult-sized 4x2x2 enclosure with sparse decorations. Even if you can manage that climate and dial it in so it's, a great thermal gradient and nice and humid respectively for a carpet python. Oftentimes when you take a small, young, inexperienced animal and put it in a large enclosure, that vulnerability, that exposure, that open space becomes very apparent. You'll see a very defensive and scared behavioral shift where they will go off of food. They will be very defensive and striky and really just unpleasant. And if you know anything about snake behavior, it would tell you that snake is not having a great time. It's stressed. It's overwhelmed. Right. Again,
and this is something with all kinds of species of snakes. But,
totally.
But I want to hit a point, a thing that you said. You mentioned sparse decorations. So meaning that, potentially you could have a little baby in a giant cage as long as it's packed with stuff where they feel like they're hidden all the time.
Yeah.
They don't look out of their hide and see this massive space that predators could come bounding across.
Yeah. Visual barriers, tank decor. It can be as simple as you want. If you don't want to deal with, plastic plants that you have to wipe down to get clean. I've heard of everything from venomous keepers, acclimating cobras in quarantine by crumpling up loosely big balls of butcher paper and just stuffing it in the enclosure. And it fills up the vertical space. They can throw it away. The animals can get it soiled and dirty, and they can make it again really cheap and easily. And what it does is it just fills up the visual space in the same way, a big bush or a crazy thick branch would, your visual barriers. That's a really big thing in the crocodilian world when you're cohabiting multiple individuals in a large environment. You need a lot of visual barriers because they just, stress on those animals can come in the simplest and easy to miss ways. And it's just, they don't give us a lot of body language like a lot of other animals do. So, yeah.
Right. So let's go into setup for these, since we started talking about it a little bit. I'll just say with my snakes, I got them from Nick Mutton. So they came from Nick as youngsters. He had them in little tubs. And I put them in bigger tubs, but they were still tubs. So they're, not seeing me all the time. And after a few months, I moved them to bioactive cages, and they're doing well in those now. So but they're still pretty small snakes. A yearling carpet python is not a large animal. So as they grow, what's the ideal setup for these snakes? And generally for the biggest carpet python, what would you say would be an ideal pet keeping, not breeder setup, but pet keeping setup?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a fantastic question. Baby snakes, you start them in something that they're not going to get us out of, something you don't want any little gaps for cables and things if it's still young and small. But, if the animal can stretch out and move around, but also have some security and doesn't feel completely overexposed, you could start a little guy. Like you said, if it comes from a tub, transition it to a tub for maybe like a week or two. And then oftentimes that's just plenty. Sometimes you don't even need to do that. And you could put them straight into something like a small exoterra. Again, fill it with some foliage, cork, things like that, because that will be new stimulus to the animal. But these are confident snakes. And if done right and it's warm and it's accommodating and there's shelter, they'll usually transition to that setup very nicely. And that's when you can start having a lot of fun. You can start putting in like bamboo perching and cool wood branches and stuff. And at that point, the sky's the limit. If they're eating for you, there really is no off limits of what you can do. It's kind of funny. They're like the corn snake of pythons, in like how hardy they are, how variable they are, and they'll get a little bit bigger, but they're very active. And, an adult can, like a very large 7.5-foot Bredli's python female, if you were to go like a 6 foot by 6 foot enclosure, say you want to do a nice statement piece in your reptile room or your living room or something, you can repurpose old furniture or build something custom, or a lot of these companies that have started to dabble in some of the larger enclosures. If you wanted to go elaborate and put like a tree in there and some cool branches, every single carpet python will use it. They'll all do fine in something that large. But that's kind of like if you wanted to do a statement piece. I would say for the average keeper, if that's unattainable and that's a little too extravagant, for the most part, most of them will fit comfortably in something quite common and regularly available as a 4x2x2. 2 feet of vertical space allows somebody to put totes in for humid hides. If you want to do perches across horizontally, if you wanted to put tree branches or manzanita wood and things like that in there, you can go higher, obviously, but 4x2x2 is a very commonly available size, and I would say that would accommodate the majority of carpet pythons at the adult size, with the exception of maybe, like a really large Bredli's python or a really large southern coastal, maybe a really big jungle. But again, we're talking about snakes that we think about 6-7 feet and instantly think of a 6 or 7 foot tall person that comes with a lot of mass. But a 6 or 7 foot tall person can't comfortably occupy 1 square foot of space like a 6 or 7 foot long carpet python can. And we're talking about animals that like feeling snug in secure places and stuff when they're sleeping and just relaxed. But you give them the room, they're going to use every inch of it. So I would say sky's the limit with them. But if you want to aim for something in the 4x2x2 range, you're really going to have a lot of room to play with there for a lot of the majority of the animals. Yeah.
I was going to ask this at the beginning, and I think I forgot to ask the question, but I already know what the answer is your favorite locality is a smaller locality. So let's talk about that for a second.
Yeah. So the Papuan carpets, formerly known as Irian Jayas, there's technically a locality of a subspecies until, maybe one day evolution sees that they progress into full species status. They are Morelia spilota variegata. So they are on the DNA level the same thing as the Darwin carpets and the Cape Yorks up north in Australia. And so they've sort of been separated by rising water levels. They're on their own island. Those you can actually still get legal imports out of a country into the United States or Europe, where have you. And in my experience, they tend to stay smaller. I love them because of their color palette, and they're sort of the underdog of the carpet python world. They've sort of been overlooked as these not Australian sort of dirt brown snakes. And it couldn't be further from the truth. They have as much spunk and personality as every other carpet python, and they arguably have a wider color palette.
Right.
And, yeah,
Riley, I want to go over this size a little bit, and this might be putting you on the spot. I don't know if any are available, but do you have any adults that you could just pull out to show us what a 5.5, 6 foot?
Absolutely. I will pull you out my cornerstone animal. His name is Redman. And if anybody follows my YouTube channel, there'll be a whole video coming out on him actually next week that is literally just about him, who he is, where he gets his name, why he's so special, and just kind of why I talk about him a lot. And this is him right here. And I can hold him with one hand. And he's actually a larger male. I have older males that are smaller than him. I have males that are around the same age as him that are smaller. And it's not for lack of feeding. They will certainly eat. I mean, this guy can eat large rats if I gave it to him, even though he is much slender.
He is thinner than a large adult male ball python.
Yeah,
he's longer, but he's thinner than a male adult ball python.
Sure, and I would say this is probably average for an adult across the board. Females might get a little bit bigger, and with my experience with what I brought in from wild caught stuff that I've raised up and seen adults, they're on the same size trajectory as something like this in captivity. So,
and also look at those colors. I keep jumping on different things, but that is not just a brown snake.
No, sir.
The Redman is absolutely beautiful. I got to see him in person recently when we filmed a video that'll be out on my channel where we talk about Redman and some other snakes.
He's a bit of a celebrity around here. He's becoming a household name. And there are plenty that are very black and melanistic with, nice buckskin highlights and maybe little bits of orange flames. And that's a beautiful look too. I have plenty of those, if not just as many of those very dark velvety black ones as much as these orange ones, and everything in between. And the other little hidden secret about Papuan carpets is that they fire up and down color-wise a lot like a crested gecko does. So if I were to look at this guy, maybe while he's sleeping and resting, he might not be as vibrant. But if I were to check on him maybe like 7:30 at night, picking up while the lights are just about to go off, he might look entirely different than he did a few hours prior. And some animals have more of a dramatic color change than that. And oftentimes those very heavily melanistic, those very black ones tend to fire up the most different. I have some that will fire up like bright gray and white up the side and yellow and almost look like a jungle carpet python at sometimes. So they're just magic. They're just special animals.
That's cool. So let's jump into color a little bit with regard to morphs, because some subspecies have a lot of morphs, I think, and some don't. Is that the like what you were holding there, the Papuan, not a ton of morphs, right? You're
correct.
Your sound went out. There you go.
Yeah. So Popwins, there's only two mutations other than sort of, line breeding for natural occurring phenotypes like stripes or bands or colors. You have a recessive granite mutation, and you have an incomplete dominant axanthic mutation that was initially thought as recessive, but a lot more breeding and work has shown otherwise for the axanthic trait. But yeah, so there's only a handful of mutations in carpet pythons, and some come from certain subspecies and not others. So if we want to go back to Bredli's pythons, they have their own morphs. They have a genetic stripe. They have a stonewash, which is kind of like a light piebaldism, arguably. And then they have a sort of polygenic hypo mutation, which is also affiliated with a line. So you have that going. You have the Jaguar mutation in coastals. You have a tiger mutation, which is also polygenic. You have caramel, which is incomplete dominant. You have hypo, which is incomplete dominant. Axanthic, which is incomplete dominant. In diamond pythons, you have reduced pattern, which is undetermined at the moment. It behaves very bizarrely and kind of doesn't have a trajectory that plays along with Mendelian genetics. What else? Jungles, you have the zebra mutation, which is incomplete dominant. So the super or homozygous form is different. You have various lines like Nick's ivory line or mutation. There's just so much to play with. Albinos in the Darwins, reduced pattern in the Darwins. You have inlands.
There's also been quite a bit of crossing of the subspecies, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what's the thought on that within the carpet python community? Because I know other snake communities, not the community, but a lot of people frown on crossbreeding of snakes.
Sure.
But if you're crossbreeding, subspecies of carpet pythons, what's the thought on that general consensus?
General consensus is, as long as it's fully disclosed as to what the animals are you're producing are, if it is a cross, it's not a problem. Again, you might get a different response based on who you ask, but particularly over in Australia, crossing stuff and making beautiful snakes, as long as it's a beautiful snake, they don't care if it's crossed. Arguably, it's harder to find some pure stuff over there, which is a tragedy in its own right. But here in the States, with the exception of Papuan carpets, what we have is what we have. It's rather finite other than what people import out of Europe. And there's this consensus where we want to keep a lot of these things pure. We don't want to lose them for future generations to come. However, you can also make these beautiful fun crosses. There's room for both. And we're starting to see what these Australian keepers have been making over there, and it's starting to catch fire over here. For example, albino bredli pythons over in Australia were first made maybe 10 years ago. Stunning animal. Just electric orange, bright, but that's a full species hybrid. That is Morelia bredli and Morelia spilota variegata. Do they care? No. Is it a beautiful snake? Yes. That's all that really matters. These animals aren't going back into the wild. If it's going to be a pet, it's up to the purchaser or a person acquiring the pet if that information is important or relevant to them. If it's a breeder, you just pass that information on for their records and future breeding details. There's room for both. There's not enough carpet python love out there. So I think, that's where it's going these days.
Yeah. And then speaking of controversial issues, just real quick, let's touch on the Jaguar gene, which is similar to spider and ball pythons. It creates a wobble.
Yes.
What's the thought on that?
So I've read the that paper that came out a few years ago where they looked at the inner ear tissues of the various ball pythons that were part of the study that had the spider gene and those that didn't. And they determined that it was a malformation in this tissue within what we would call the eardrum, essentially.
Not a neurological problem, as everybody still says.
Correct. Right. We just say neuro because it's just a quick offhand way. I still say neuro too. I do like to hear that people call it the wobble now, because that just implies it's this. That's the side effect. It's not. Yeah. It doesn't have any implication otherwise. Right. So it's the exact same gene. It is exactly the same gene. So if you produce a super spider, you get a lethal white snake that doesn't develop lungs and doesn't hatch or fully develop or make it out of the egg. If you produce a super jaguar, same thing. If you breed a jaguar to a spider and get hybrid results, you will get the same exact thing. It is the exact same gene across the board, does the exact same thing. So we've obviously seen all the controversy in the ball python world play out about whether or not this gene should be allowed at shows, should it be bred? And there's a lot of strong opinions on both sides that have a lot of merit, right? I think the carpet python world has had enough sort of internal drama where that sort of issue was seen outside and kind of everyone is just like, yeah, we get the same issue here. We're just it is what it is. And people are just going to choose to work with it if they want to and not if they don't. There are various degrees of how it manifests, and I've seen extreme manifestations where an animal will eat and flip upside down and arch its back and look very uncomfortable and just not normal. It doesn't look good. It looks very stressful. And I've also seen and produced ball pythons that did the same thing, where I had to make sure they didn't drown in their water bowl from sleeping upside down.
Yeah.
But I've also had some where they showed no signs of any head wobble. The most you might see is sometimes they'd rest with their head cocked at like 5 degrees off level.
Right.
Now, does that mean because we get some that are basically fine, that it excuses the ones that definitely come out like not having a good time and it's probably a very stressful existence? It's hard to say. I have kept multiple Jaguars over the years, and they've all passed from something that started with stress that other snakes endured and did not succumb to. So
that's a good thing to know.
Yeah, in my experience, even the ones with little to no wobble manifestations, like a beautiful tiger jag, where for whatever reason you just don't really get a lot of that manifestation in the tiger jags. I've had even those, just, the stress of a winter cool down, boom, that was enough.
Wow.
Whereas everything else was fine.
Yeah.
So I do find that they are very prone to stress, and at that point, it does become a bit of an ethical, moral question. And I do think production of Jaguars has dramatically decreased. Dramatically. Yeah. They're not gone forever, because it's impossible to beat a beautiful gamma line diamond jungle jag, or a beautiful jungle jag, or a really reduced pattern tiger jag, or something like that. The crazy busyness of a zebra jag. Beautiful. However, the more wacky you get with those crosses, the more diverse, the more genes you throw in there, the higher likelihood the animals that come out possessing the Jaguar gene are going to manifest those symptoms. For whatever reason, it just seems to be more and more problematic the more you play with it. So yeah, I don't know. Take that for what it's worth.
It sounds like it's going a little bit the way of the spider gene. Same thing. Not many breeders are trying to produce spiders anymore.
Yeah.
We only have about 10 minutes left, and I have a handful of things I want to get to. So real quick, let's go back to care and talk specifically about feeding. I want to know what your strategies are with regards specifically to raising up a snake. Some people will slow grow from the very beginning. A lot of people for different species will feed heavily until they get to a point, and then they slow it down. What's your strategy for feeding these snakes?
So I do a little bit of a seasonal feeding with some shift at different life stages, but with some consistency across the board. So babies, when they first hatch, I like to get them started. I want them eating. I used to feed every other week, even when they first started, and I found it just took a little bit too long, and some of them just kind of lingered a little too long. Maybe didn't have the same, kind of drive. Whereas now I like to feed every single week for the babies. Once they hatch, they shed. I give them about 3 to 4 weeks to get hungry and digest all that yolk from the egg. And then we start feeding trials, and we do week until they get onto something like a hopper or a rat fuzzy. Once they're on something like that, then we're at every 2 weeks. And that's going to be the most frequent that they will ever really eat, unless we're getting into breeding stuff. Then I just like to keep every 2 to 3 weeks, depending on how they're looking, if they're in shed, when was their last bowel movement, and time of year. But regardless of age, everybody gets the winter off in Casa de Riley here. So babies will get a winter, just like the adults, where after Halloween...
So are we talking a full, like, 3 months, 2 months, 3 months?
Yeah, about 2.5, 3 months. They will get no food. They will get truncated access to heat during the day, and nighttime temperatures will get into the low 70s. And then it'll go back up in February, mid-February, around spring. And I will sort of adjust when I start and raise up based on the weather outside, because I don't want to fight Mother Nature too much. They are going to pick up on those cues regardless. And then, so I find that creates an animal that comes out of winter very hungry and ready to eat. They're not constantly in this digestive mode where they're just this fat, squishy sausage always digesting and going to the bathroom. You have time to play with the animal. They get some lean muscle going, and then it keeps them from being obese. You get an animal that is sort of programmed to think like it's not food every week. It's not food every week. We had a few months without food. You never know if that's coming back. And You don't have to do that as a pet keeper. I do that because I'm setting animals up for success if they end up being a breeder. In my opinion, I think it makes an animal more conditioned when they're primed for breeding, if they've already been through a few winters and seasonal cycles.
Are you feeding birds also, or is it just rodents?
I do feed birds, absolutely. I do feed quail and chicks. It's good to throw some variety in there. They naturally eat birds out in the wild, cockatoos, parrots, all sorts of stuff like that. Sometimes baby carpets, if they don't want to take rodents for you, quail and chicks are the way to get them going. So birds are a wonderful food item to incorporate into their diet.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk now a little bit more about myths. You know, we touched on it a little bit about that they're aggressive, they get way too big, such like that. What are some of the most common myths that you've heard that you would like to dispel?
The most common is the temperament thing. And I'm guilty as everybody else for showing, funny kind of clips of a snake maybe striking at me while I'm giving a speech, or chewing on my finger because it's adorable or whatever, and it's inconsequential in the moment. But it's a very rare thing, and that's honestly why I capture it, because it's so rare of an occurrence. I'm like, oh, look at what's happening. They're normally sweethearts. I have hooks. I use hooks to open enclosures and doors when I'm feeding, because these animals will come launching out when they're food motivated, and sometimes your hand being right at the edge of the glass door is enough for them to redirect and grab your fingers on the edge of a glass door or something like that. So I'll use hooks for feeding, but honestly, these animals are sweethearts, and they're very smart, and they know what's going on. And if you spend any amount of time with say you get one carpet python, you spend any amount of time with it, it's going to know your routine as much as you're going to know its behavior and how it's responding. So I can reach in and bare hand even the most dodgy animal just by reading it. And once you get them out of the enclosure, 99% of them just become more interested in exploring, anchoring on with their tail, holding on, and just kind of being supported and cruising around on you, the human tree. So I rarely find that they're grouchy and mean. I do have some that love to bite first, ask questions later, but it's like one or two, and they do that once. And if you know it's coming, you can avoid it with a snake hook and get them out and break them of that habit. You just have to kind of know how they work. Every animal has their different line in the sand, just like people do. Some people don't like, being talked to before they've had coffee, and that's fine. That's totally fine. Some of these snakes in here are just like that too. So, they all have personality, and I would say it's very rare that I have anything close to that stereotypical, monstrous, mythical personality.
Right.
The other one would be size. I had a conversation with a new follower who I was doing a Palm Street live, just talking about carpet pythons, educating a different circle of people. And somebody reached out after and was like, I had no idea that those were that beautiful and they stayed that small. I was under the impression they got 12 feet. 12? We're talking about the smallest. So
they're thinking of scrub pythons.
Sure, probably. Yeah. And that's not wrong. And I don't blame them for thinking that. They look similar. There's a lot of overlap. And we're talking about species that aren't necessarily in the main realm of focus of pet keepers, right? So right. That's why we're here today. They're not that big. I think the biggest carpet python that I've ever kept was an 8-foot jungle carpet, and it was the first one of mine, sibling to one I have currently. And I unfortunately killed that animal with kindness because I enjoyed watching her feed so much, and I did not know about my current regiment of feeding and spreading things out and pacing them. Because how many times do we hear, oh, my snake was hungry, it was looking at me, so I fed it. Carpet pythons are the epitome of that. They'll eat and then come look at you for more. They'll always eat. So, I was prone to that, and she didn't see her 11th birthday, but she got over 8 feet. God. Yeah. So
wow.
That's not normal. She should have made 20 and she should have probably stopped at 6.5, maybe 7 feet. And I didn't know better.
Yeah.
So
we all make mistakes early on,
Yeah. Yeah. And so, and like we had talked about earlier, the folks over in Australia will regularly find, maybe a large exceptional diamond python or a southern coastal that gets that big, or something rare and extreme, but it is not the norm.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, so we got to wrap this up. We only have a couple minutes left. I have one rapid fire question for you. That is, you have been told that you can only keep one snake for the rest of your life. What is the species, locality, morph? Go. Rapid fire.
Papuan carpet, no morph. Just
It's red man.
red man.
It's red man.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It would,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
Yeah. It would probably just
okay.
some selectively bred, beautiful Papuan carpets.
Yeah, yeah. All right, you guys, thanks so much for watching. If you want to learn more about carpet pythons, you can go to YouTube and type in Riley's Reptiles, and you'll see his channel, and you'll get all kinds of information. Thanks so much for watching. Now you can go back to epic.live and choose your next session.